What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sitdown, a crime history podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Nadu. As always, we are presented by Barstool Sports. Another week, another episode of the Sitdown, and we have a show today planned that I got to tell you, I get asked about all the time, and I'm very much looking forward to unearthing the legend of Santo Trafficante Jr. A lot of the time when I hear about Mount Rushmores and the Mafia, we don't ever hear Trafficante's name mentioned. And much like Carlos Marcello, I think he had the same reputation, quite frankly. And I think when we look at the legacy of Trafficante, I'm not sure in history there's anyone much bigger, much more powerful than Santo Trafficante Jr. We're going to talk about him and his father today. And we're going to do that with one of our favorite guests. He is from Barstool, Chicago. He is a coworker. And I got to tell you, a lot of people enjoyed our episode about 3 weeks ago on Chicago gangster Johnny Roselli. I thought it'd be perfect to bring him back for this subject. It is our friend Barstool Chief. Chief, how are you?
I'm good. I enjoyed it. I got to tell you, I enjoyed doing that episode. So it was a lot of fun. So I'm thrilled to be back. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no doubt. I got so many messages. A lot of people enjoyed kind of our back and forth, and that's the good thing about being a Barstool. There's so many people, as we talked about, that have different interests and different enjoyment. So it's nice to have you back. And I know you are someone that we talked before in the first episode about how we're all kind of interested in the JFK stuff. And again, Trafficante plays a big role, not only this, but the Castro stuff. And really like Meyer Lansky, I think Trafficante is really, to my knowledge, to my estimation, really the kind of the guy that was in Cuba. He was the guy that really, I think, took that kind of barren wasteland of Florida from his father and kind of developed it into this burgeoning area where tons of money was being made. They were the conduit to New York, into Cuba for the most part. And he's a really interesting individual. And unlike many folks, his father was one of the most powerful people in the country in the 30s. So, a lot on the bone with Santo Trafficante.
Yeah, I actually just had an idea for a podcast for you and I, where maybe we solve the JFK assassination, and I'll do the bulk that's all on CIA and that kind of stuff, and you take the mob angle, and then we do like a 10-parter, and we just try to see if we can push it together.
I think it's a great idea. We could it's almost like our own Warren Commission.
We'll redo it. We'll do it for real this time.
Yeah, and maybe we, to the powers that be, get it sent to the Department of Justice and see if we can't unearth it like certain people do. That's a great idea. And again, today's subject plays, I think, a huge role. Plus, I think we start to get into some of the Jimmy Hoffa stuff as to his involvement in all this. And it's really just peeling back the onion of another person in this. And about a month ago when I did the Carlos Marcello show, I've regarded Carlos Marcello as the most powerful and influential individual in the history of the mafia in this country. I don't believe there's anyone above him as far as power and prestige, as far as money, that sort of thing, and just his connections. Trafficante's right there with him. They were kind of those, off the beaten path. They weren't controlled by anybody. They did what they wanted to do. They had their own territory, and they were very powerful. And I remember when I created this show, it is unearthing the history of how connected the mob truly was and how much influence they had over this country. So I'm looking forward to kind of getting into it. But before we do that, Chief, I just wanted to bring up some mob news. I always try to, if we have mob news. I want to bring up the fact that Louis Gigante died over the weekend, the brother of the Chin Gigante, one of the most recognizable mobsters in New York history. Chin obviously was the boss of the Genovese crime family for 2 decades, probably longer for looking at front bosses and things like that. Chin had 4 brothers, and 2 followed him into the life, and 2 didn't. And one of them was his brother, Louis, who was a priest, an ordained a priest in the Catholic Church. But I did a video recently on our YouTube channel and unearthed not only that Louis Gigante was a mob associate, but he was an incredibly big earner for the Genovese crime family, all while being a priest in a church in the Bronx. He had tons and tons of connections to the mafia, not just familially. He knew a lot of people. He was involved with real estate and construction scams, and really by the end was an embarrassment. His buildings had fallen apart, and I felt it kind of just important to discuss that. He was 90 years old, and I'm sure you probably saw it in the news. He was also in the news last year after we would find some information out that in 1976, he was possibly involved with some sex abuse cases. Now, those ultimately will not see the light of day due to the fact that Mr. Gigante died. But, really just another tentacle of that family. They were incredibly powerful, particularly Vincent. And, his brother will never get the mantle of being a mob soldier, but he was one of the few people, Chief, that in the history of the mob was able to use a veil of religion to kind of mask the fact that he was a mob associate. And just a death to remember, obviously with some connections to the mafia. But I want to quickly ask you: you're obviously in Chicago. I know you're from the Northeast. What do you know about Chin Gigante? Are you someone that
No, you just gave me an education. I kind of scoffed for a second there with the only guy using the veil of the cloth that we know about. I feel like there's probably a lot of guys who grew up in the same neighborhood. They went to the same Catholic school. One guy went one way, one guy went the other way.
Oh, yeah.
And it's just a matter of who knew what and who found out what. But I bet you the church and the mob have a lot deeper connections than we realize.
Well, it's funny you say that, because in the YouTube show I did, I put it out through the fact that he died. And I said that, in these neighborhoods, these ethnic neighborhoods back in the 40s, 30s, 50s, you are either a priest, a civil servant, or a mobster. And, the priests back in those days were, they had ears to the streets. You're growing up in the Lower East Side or Hell's Kitchen or Brooklyn, mob guys. It's just that simple.
They're hearing confessions. At minimum, they're hearing confessions. They know what's up. They took a vow, so they can't say anything, obviously. But I guarantee you, if you were going to be like, if you wanted to get to the bottom of anything, I would start with the priest.
Well, luckily for priests, they have that same level of psychiatrists where they can't discuss the things they hear. But I think if you were willing to get a priest under oath, he could tell you a lot of things that he's heard over the years, because these gangsters, they use I had Bill Cotolo on last week, a Colombo crime family associate. His father was an underboss in the Colombo crime family. He talked about that. His father was very religious, and he believed that if he went to church on Sunday, it would forgive the things that he did, right? And I think a lot of these gangsters think that religion is going to save them someday. And we see it a lot with even terrorists and things like that. They believe that because they're religious, they're being kind of told to do this stuff. And this is all about, in the end, being in heaven and being free. And it's fascinating, really. But
I don't know if you're Catholic. I'm a Catholic. I was raised Catholic. And it's just, there's like a built-in get out of jail free card, where as long as you repent and you're truly sorry for your sins, it's like, well, if you had 90 years of killing people, you're straight. You're good.
Yeah.
So
and we heard that in The Bronx Tale, where young Calodro talks about that. He loved being Catholic because you could do what you had to do, go to confession, and that was that. And that was what we were kind of told. I remember as a kid, you go to confession, you say everything you did, and everything's fine. No issues. But just kind of wanted to bring that up. Let's get into Santo Trafficante. And like I said, you cannot talk about Santo Trafficante Jr. without talking about Santo Trafficante Sr. And really, to the mid-50s, was one of the more powerful people in the United States when it comes to the mafia. So let's get into it. What do you say, Chief? Santo Trafficante on the sit-down. I want to first talk about Santo Sr. He would actually come over to the United States in 1901. He was 14 years old at the time. He was born in 1886. So, shy of his 14th birthday, his family and him come over from Sicily. They were from an area in Sicily called Cianciana. And if you look at the map here, it's basically just north of Agrigento in southern Sicily. And, this is something I've noticed about Sicilian communities in this country. And I know even in my own community now, my best friend growing up was Sicilian, and him and his family and every Sicilian in this area were from one town in Sicily. And what I learned about Santo Sr. is all the people from that town came into Ellis Island, and then a lot of them went south to Tampa. And if you look into the history of Ybor City, which is a neighborhood in Tampa, which is very Cuban, for years in the 10s and 20s, it was very Italian, and most of the immigrants were from this area of kind of southwestern Sicily. So he gets there at 14, and kind of isn't really sure where to go. As I said, Ybor City in that time was, full of immigrants, cigar factories, a lot of Cubans, a lot of Italians, a lot of Spanish
Well,
folks.
that's what he did.
Yeah,
He was just a successful cigar store owner.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's what
It's a
we
nice
hear.
cover.
Right. We hear that they have these gainful measures of employment, right? But in the end, they're doing other things as well. He ultimately, 8 years later, when he's 22, meets a woman called Maria. They court up. And Maria's brother was actually a big time drug dealer in Ybor City at the time. If we think about the geography of Florida, obviously very close to Cuba. And Cuba at the time was a main focal point for the Corsicans and French that were sending drugs into this country. It went through Cuba and then right up to Tampa. Yep. So Tampa became a huge hub for it, frankly.
Yeah, that's where they were saying like all the heroin for the United States at one point, where the vast majority of it came in through those ports.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Cuba up the Gulf Coast. Yeah.
Yeah. And in 1914, after they're married a few years, the Trafficantes would have 5 sons. The second son was Luigi, aka Santo Trafficante Jr., and he would take his father's name. And his father would talk about young Santo. He would never call and say like he was like his favorite son, but you could tell that he was different than his brothers. He had that business mind. He wanted to be like his father, just like we've seen all these guys that follow their fathers into life. He had that mind for business. He had that kind of a leader type of kind of mind. And I think really from birth, he knew what he was going to be. And he would actually drop out of school, Santo Trafficante, in the 10th grade. So he's born November 15th, 1914. And in the early 20s, as we know, Prohibition is taken over, particularly on the East Coast, Chicago. The prohibition on alcohol was huge because there needed to be an illicit way to, help the thirst of not having alcohol, right?
Yeah, you need, and that's what it's so funny that, they were going to clean up the country by getting rid of booze, and they just turned it in like it was a shot in the arm for the mafia. They gave them an automatic industry. But, and I don't know if you have this on your books too, but I feel like so many of these guys, when we read the stories, Rosselli was a similar thing, where they're just looking for a way to make money. They're looking for an angle. And Santo Sr., he's just running gambling rings. And that's, it's just something he saw on the street. He saw these Cubans and these Hispanics running this game called Bolita, which I had never heard of before. Have you heard of Bolita?
Yeah, so Bolita is this it's almost like a lottery. It's no different than the 11 o'clock lottery where they draw little balls out of a machine. But the mob, particularly in Ybor City, where you're talking about in Tampa, Bolita is a Dominican Cuban game. And there's actually guys in New York, Jose Battle, for instance, made millions of dollars in the Bolita trade. And to this day, if you go to Latin communities in America, they still play Bolita.
Yeah,
and
what sounds awesome. It sounds like something that I would get hooked on because it's so simple. You have all these little balls. That's what Bolita means. These little balls with a number on it, like you're saying, like the lottery balls. And then it also seems like the easiest game to fix. And the
lottery. And whether it's the lottery, you're right. The lottery for most people is you spend a little to make a lot, right? And everyone plays lottery. We saw that with the numbers racket for years as well. It's a game that ultimately would become licensed, and these states would use it. Now they use it today to benefit older Pennsylvanians or older people from Illinois or whoever. So that's exactly what they were doing, Chief. They were, putting sand in the balls to mess with them, all sorts of things. And they were fixing it.
They would freeze some. They would put lead or like different weighted balls so they would sink to the bottom. They would do all sorts of different things, and then they would just rig it to get their cut. And then like the local community it sounds like they would have like these I went into a rabbit hole in Bolita because I'm like, oh my God, I wish that I could just run this on like my street in Chicago. Just like, hey, let's play some Bolita for the, little summer picnics that we have in the neighborhood. But they would have all these schemes, and then people would have like little rituals and little like good luck charms that would never work. And then they would always just and they made so much money. And that's where Trafficante got in. I always wonder if, like, how different history would be if some of these guys, like we talked about Rosselli, like he just always knew he wanted to be, he looked at those guys like they've made it. It feels like Trafficante was a little different, where he was just like, hey, like this is kind of fun. This is a way to make some money. And then before you know it, you're running in some pretty dark circles.
Well, yeah, and I think, I've said before, like, I think one of the best questions we do Q&As occasionally in this show. And one time I got a question of, where would the mob be if prohibition had never happened? And when I think about it, I think probably, I don't know if it would be anywhere near where what ended up being, because the people in prohibition, whether it be Al Capone or people like this, they were just kind of gang members, really. They were running amok and making money. If they didn't have prohibition, I'm sure they would have found other ways to make money through Bolita or the drug trade or whatever. But it is an interesting question. But yeah, that's what Trafficante Sr. was doing. He would make money through bootlegging. He would then turn it into the Bolita markets. And then ultimately he would gain the respect of this individual, Ignacio Antinori. Antinori was the original boss in Tampa. He was this old world guy, and he became impressed with Trafficante Sr. He was able to make money every way. And Antinori was very involved in heroin. He was a huge heroin dealer. When we talk about, the Corsica, France area to Cuba and then to Tampa, he was the end point. And when I did the Chapo Guzman show, I talked about this. Back in the 80s, Mexico was looked at as a trampoline because heroin and cocaine, well, particularly cocaine, was coming from Colombia, bouncing off Mexico and going into the United States. In terms of what we're looking at here, it comes in from Marseille in France or Corsica, bounces off Cuba, and then into Tampa. And Tampa is not only selling it on the streets in Tampa to addicts, but what they're also doing they're wholesaling it to St. Louis, to Detroit, to different areas. And they're making hand over fist. Heroin is
a point of entry. Yeah, it was like Tampa was Tijuana. It was the same. Yeah,
absolutely. And by the early 20s, we look at what Ybor City is. At one point, it was called Little Italy. In fact, by the 1900s, there was about 3,000 people that were of Italian descent living in Ybor, which is pretty interesting. Now, today, if you go to Ybor, it's very Latin, and it always has been. But one thing that would help the Trafficantes is, and this would be something very important when we get into the days of Cuba down the road for the mob, one of the things that set the Trafficantes apart from the guys in New York was that they spoke Spanish.
Which, trilingual.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, what I find interesting in that is how, if you were an Italian living in New York, let's say the Bronx or Brooklyn, Italian and Spanish are very similar. And most Italians that I know that speak Italian also speak Spanish. So I found it interesting that none of them knew Spanish. And these guys, just being in that Latin-infused community down in Tampa, knew Spanish, and that was very big. And again, I'm not saying that Bolita money is legal, but it's better than drug money or whatever.
Totally. Yeah.
Right. And you're taking all that kind of money that you're making in illicit businesses and you're putting it into hotels. You're putting it into drive-in movie theaters. You're allowing your son, who's coming up and has dropped out of school by this point and is hanging around you, you're allowing him to get involved. And by like the late 20s, we see what's going on in New York. We see that a guy called Lucky Luciano is making his moves. He's offing these old guys and taking the mafia into what we know it as today, the five family structure.
Yep.
And what he finds out is there's this guy down in Tampa, Santo Trafficante Sr., who by this point is one of the main mob figures down there. They have the 29 conference up in Atlantic City, and Trafficante Sr. is there. Yeah. He's looked at as our guy down in Florida. Because remember, Chief, Lucky Luciano wanted to do business with Italians and people that were in the same business as he was, with no umbrage, with no violence, and they everyone and all make money.
Yeah, violence is always bad for business, unless maybe you're the U.S. government, you're selling bombs and stuff. But one of those little like funny stories, at least I thought it was funny, the Trafficante, which, he anointed his second son, like you're saying, like is not his quote unquote favorite, but maybe his most promising. The reason he dropped out of school at 15 is because his dad told him to. Like, hey, like you're the smartest kid here. The best thing you can do is drop out of school and start hanging out with me. And then they had that, they called it the era of blood down in Tampa. It was a very contentious period. Basically sent him on a study abroad to New York.
Right, because that's such a good point, but I was glad you brought that up because one thing I haven't mentioned is Antonori. He's still around, right? This old guy. He's in a war over Belita and other things with this guy, Charlie Wall. Now, Charlie Wall was not Italian. He was just because we remember, Chief, I think it's important to talk about like in the early 1900s, Tampa was
Southern,
essentially a swampland,
yeah.
basically. And it was a bunch of like farmer types that, like Charlie Wall, found money in lotteries. And Wall, by this point, was an old guy, and he was very much entrenched in Belita. And he and Antonori went back and forth throughout the 30s. So you're right. Trafficante Sr. tells the kid, hey, get out of here for a while, go learn some things elsewhere. And by, again, like the mid 30s, he's kind of the guy that, in a way, is the top power because the influence of Antonori is now weakened because him and Wall are going back and forth. And he just kind of comes out on top at the end as the guy.
Ultimo hombre, the top man. And it was after that war. And they called Charlie Wall was the redneck mob boss.
Yeah,
so like
pretty much.
He kind of came from the swamp and the sticks, but he was there first. So he had established himself. He had the political connections. He had the police. And it was kind of the way it reads like an upset that the Italians and Antonori and then ultimately Trafficante, who just kind of went into maybe not into the shadows, but he kind of stayed out of the fray and let those two guys just battle it out and kill each other eventually. And then he came out as, the top guy.
Right. And by the early 40s, Trafficante Sr. is one of the most transcendent mob bosses in America. He has his own territories. He has connections up to New York with all those guys. He's entrenched with people like Marcello. Everybody's connected. They're all making tons of money. And where are they making money? Belita, the drug trade. And guys, again, I don't want to keep belaboring this point. When we talk about the drug trade at this magnitude, I don't think we quite realize how much money the mob is making, right? Whether it be through the French Connection or through this type of thing. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars through white powder. Heroin is huge money. There's no secret with that. And it's always been a very prohibitive market. And it's something that, while being illegal, and that's when we talk about drug prohibition, some of the issues we have in our country is because of the drug trade. And again, like, this is big money. There's no sugarcoating it. By the mid 40s, Chief, we would also find out that it's actually coming to earth that at certain points in Tampa, Santo Trafficante Sr. was spotted at a place called the Columbia, which was a restaurant with top level Bureau of Narcotics people. So we were beginning to find out that he possibly had connections through them, basically to run his product. It's no secret that over the years, the government has been involved with large scale drug production and likely pumping it into communities. Yeah. There's a book, Cigar City Mafia. It's really the complete history of the Tampa underworld. It's a great book. Scott Dietz wrote it, good guy. He talks about the fact that there was a guy that he was meeting at one point in the Bureau of Narcotics. And what that kind of tells me is he's making these relationships and these connections and really being allowed to work in, relative
unfettered freedom. Is
Yeah.
what it sounds like. Like,
Absolutely.
just come play. Hey, like, just go do your thing. Everybody gets a little taste and away they go. It's like the old, oh man, I'm blank. I'm so bad with celebrity names. We had him in here. Ice Cube. Sure. Where he's like, talking about how the government is involved in this. He's like, well, the cocaine comes from Colombia, an AK-47 comes from Russia. And I don't have a passport. So tell me how I got both. And that's like a fair point. Like, so somebody's running drugs and guns into these communities, and Trafficante and people like that are always there to facilitate that and then benefit.
I mean, we always, and I don't want to go off into like a rabbit hole here of this, but like, we see that today with like I don't think people realize, like, Osama bin Laden, for instance, was trained by our military to fight Russia in the 80s.
Yep.
Then 20 years later, he turns it around and, does horrible things to this country. We look at cartels in Mexico. Most of the cartels, particularly Los Zetas, people like that were truly some of the worst people in the history of the world, were trained at one point by our military. They don't get these guns, as you said. Yes, all these people. They don't get these guns from,
There is a quote from Rumsfeld in the 80s, talking about how great Saddam is because he was fighting against Iran and what a great leader he is. And then there's like this clip of he's at some press conference in the height of the Iraq War, and a reporter asks him about this quote. He just gives a little smirk, being like, "Huh, how do you like that?" And then just leaves it. He's like, because he knows, like he's like, yeah, they've been playing both sides since the beginning of time, and this is just the way business gets done, and the mafia was always part of that equation.
Well, yeah, and it's funny. I remember when Trump was in office, we'd always hear like there's always a tweet for something, right? Like there's always something that goes against what he says at somebody, and we see that with crime. It always comes back to the United States. Everything that happens comes back to this country right here. And as you said, the Trafficante lineage became who they became through these types of connections. And again, the most powerful mobsters, they had connections, whether it be Marcello or whoever. And by the mid 40s, we would find out that, Trafficante Sr. is kind of taking a lower profile. He's starting to shift a lot of his operations to his son. And what is his son starting to do? His son is starting to make inroads into Cuba. And by the late 40s, mid 40s, that's what the mafia is doing. They're aligning with the guy Fulgencio Bautista, as we've talked about. And at one point, Junior was so successful in Cuba in the late 40s and early 50s, he would actually move to Havana and move his operation, get everything funded. He had a huge interest there, just like Meyer Lansky did. And we'll talk about, obviously, we know what happens. By the early 50s, not only does Junior, but Senior also gets called to testify. Kefauver. Senior decides, I'm not doing that. I'm going to leave town. And this is kind of at the point where he says, okay, I have a little more medical problems. I'm getting older. I'm going to kind of delineate everything.
Semi-retire. Yeah.
He's still making money, but he's going to delineate most of the day-to-day operations to his son. Now, it is important to remember, there is still someone hanging around, Charlie Wall. Now, at one point, Senior told Charlie Wall, look, get lost. You're out. You'll still make a little money, but you're out. Stay away. Everything's fine. In 1954, though, Santo Trafficante Sr. dies of stomach cancer at 68 years old. Junior becomes the official boss of Tampa with his connections, his ability in politics, all these different places, all these power areas he has. He has New York. So Charlie Wall becomes, supposedly he's talking shit about Trafficante Jr. at one point. He's just running his name around the streets. Well, guess what happens to Charlie Wall? In 1955, about 8 months after Trafficante Sr. dies, Wall's wife comes home and finds him in the back of their home murdered. His throat had been cut and he was bashed in the head with a billy club. Now he's 75 years old, pretty ruthless way to kill. And this is a message. You kill someone like that, slit his throat, hit him with a billy club at 75. It was like Whitey Bulger. When Whitey Bulger was killed, he was killed very depraved. That's you want to send a message. And I think this was a message from Santo Trafficante. Look, you fuck with us.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they had to leave the country for a minute there because they had that Senate investigation. Charlie Wall straight up just testified against them. Like, you can't testify against people in your line of work and not expect any repercussions. Junior also got shot where he was in his sedan. I think he was leaving a restaurant, and there were suspicions that, hey, like maybe that was Wall. And it's like,
Wall was just a problem, right?
Yeah, that's the way to say it.
He was just an old guy that didn't get the message.
Yeah.
I always try to liken these situations to things that the audience knows about. It's kind of like you've seen Sopranos, right? Feach LaManna was just annoying. Like, he wouldn't stop bothering people. He was cutting in on Paulie's turf. He was cutting in on Tony. He was just acting annoying. And you didn't get the message. Now, Tony didn't kill Feach. He had him sent back to prison with the TV thing. But, Charlie Wall was just a pain in the ass. He was talking shit. He may have had Trafficante Jr. shot. He was talking to the government. Now, I don't quite believe that anyone really cared that he talked to the government because, again, he was not part of the mafia. I just think once Senior died, that old kind of peace treaty was done, and
Yep.
this guy flew too close to the sun. And if you're Santo Trafficante, you're just going to get rid of him. It's pretty simple.
Yeah, and I think it does feel like when you read that Junior was a lot more ruthless, and maybe had like a shorter guys had a shorter leash when he was in charge. So Charlie Wall being a dickhead running around might have, and the father would like, like, all right, like somebody go talk to him. And then Junior's just like, somebody go take care of him. And I think that feels like that might have been a little bit of the difference, where Junior was just like a smidge more ruthless. And maybe he had to be. Like, when you flash up pictures of him, he doesn't look the part, to me, at least. Like, he looks like a little more dapper, a little bit more put together. He's got the fashionable glasses. He looks more like an accountant maybe, or something like that. He doesn't scream mob boss when you look at him.
I think he really represented the sign of the times. He dressed very well, wore the suits, was cleaned up. And you're right, he did have that look of an accountant, right?
Yeah.
He had that, Meyer Lansky kind of had that suave look, but with the glasses, Trafficante definitely just looked like your neighborhood CPA or something.
Right. Yeah.
It's interesting for sure. I've always been fascinated by certain guys. And that's the thing about the mafia. I think there's this overarching thought that you have to be a complete lethal person who never loses fights and stuff. That's not true. I mean, some of the most powerful people in the history of the mob were short or they didn't look the part. It's not. Yes, exactly.
He's got that brain. Yeah.
It's all about the brain. It's all about power. And in the last case on Wall, I always liken it to John Gotti had a quote at one point when he was in prison. They had talked about killing Sam Gravano. He told his brother, look, you got to go take care of that. And he made a comment and said that bill needs still be paid. And that's kind of in a way how Charlie Wall was looked at. This bill, it needs to be paid. Yeah. It needs to get paid finally. So get rid of the guy. Things are good for Trafficante. He was the boss of a burgeoning criminal empire. He had tons of money coming in, not only through illicit, but all sorts of different business. He was making inroads into Cuba through friends of his like Meyer Lansky. I also kind of want to talk a little bit about his organization at that point. His chief enforcer was this individual, Angelo the Hammer Loscalzo. Now, Loscalzo would have a son called Vincent Loscalzo, who down the road would become a member of the Tampa mob as well, and would really take this group into the 80s and into the 2000s even, which we'll talk about a little bit later. He also had several other members that were very close to him, including a guy called Sam Carollo. Carollo was very involved in real estate, a huge developer. And again, all these guys with Italian last names that are in legit businesses. There was a guy, Sal Scaglione. He was a grocer, mob guy as well. This guy, Joe Mastretto. All these guys were very close to Santo Trafficante and were power brokers in the community. That's the one thing about the mob. And I'm sure in Chicago, it's the same way. You have legit businesses, but all these guys are shady people with buttons. They're mob people. And they use legit businesses to mask what they're really doing.
Yeah, and it's interesting. And it's one of those things where, like, I think I read somewhere that the Tampa operation, they were taking in $50 million a year in estimate. That's what that Senate investigation alleged, that they were making 50 million. So who knows if it was 50 million in the 50s a year. And then they had a similar number, was 100 million coming out of Cuba per year.
And think of that.
I don't know what that money is today. Like, like, those are big numbers by today's standards. But back then, like, you could buy a house. Like, we did a podcast on Dog Walk about, everything that's changed since 1974. You could buy a house for like $2,500. Going to Harvard costs you like $600 a year. Like, so to have like $100 million a year coming out of Cuba and 50 and they're like billionaires.
Well, think of it. I actually did the conversion in 1960. $100 million is equivalent today to like over $1 billion.
It's bananas.
So and that's just through one entity.
Yeah.
Remember, that's just through Cuba. They also have the drug business. There's hundreds of millions of dollars that's being funneled into this world. And this is just one city, right?
Yeah. It's crazy. It's like an unfathomable amount of money to think about. It's like, that's like Apple money.
Yeah.
like how many
Yeah,
iPods?
these are Fortune 500 companies. It's that
Oh,
simple.
yes, yes.
And that's where all this power and prestige comes from. We've talked, and we'll talk about it here with, this is the reason why in the 40s the federal government is going to Lucky Luciano and saying, hey, we need you to help us with, the Allied forces in
The war
Italy. And
effort.
there's a reason that the FBI and the CIA, or the CIA, went to these people to kill Fidel Castro. They were the most powerful people this country had.
Yeah.
People like Jimmy Hoffa, people like Santo Trafficante, they were more powerful really than anyone in the country at that time.
Yeah, it's another one of those hypotheticals where it's like you always hear about like John Daly, right? Like if John Daly had been born to Tiger Woods' dad, he would have been better than Tiger Woods.
Yeah.
You always wonder if Trafficante had been born to like Bill Gates's dad. Like what, like they're the same kind of ruthless, super intelligent. They just went down a different path, but they are, I mean, they're illegitimate, but they're legitimate businessmen that they know how to operate and how to turn a profit. Like that's a skill that I do think can kind of bleed into different areas if you're good enough at it. And Trafficante certainly was.
Absolutely. And we look at kind of what he was doing in Cuba at the time, because all the casinos that were being created, whether it was the Internacional, whether it was the Susay Cabaret, all these different beautiful hotels, they're all owned and have interest by Meyer Lansky, Santo Trafficante, the New York Mafia. All these people are directly involved with the creation. And we've talked about this. The president of Cuba at the time just literally said, hey, you're going to bring plenty of people here. I don't care what you do. Just make sure I make something out of it. This is good for us. This is good for you. This is good for the people of Cuba. Everybody's happy. Cuba was a beautiful palace place where we kind of likened it to, it's Las Vegas with beautiful beaches and sand. And it's that place where it's a shame that it became what it was, because it would have been a perfect vacation spot today to go to.
Oh yeah. I hope someday that things normalize there in a real way, in a transformative way where the people are actually free and they have like a real economy. But and it's right there. And that's like the other thing that we talked about, where in this country, there's the go west, young man, go west, right? And they're searching for gold and you're living out in LA, you get in the movie industry. But this is like, even in this time frame, air travel is not a thing. We're talking about a long train time to get out there. But going to Cuba when it's 90 miles from Miami, a lot easier. So if you're a New Yorker, you just, hey, I'm going down to Miami, got to get on a little puddle jumper, go to Havana, have a great time, go back. It's not as intense as going all the way across the country. America's huge. I feel like people sleep on that fact.
It really is.
If you put like the United States, it's like bigger than all of Europe. So when people give us shit like, oh, like you don't know anything about other countries, like we don't really know anything about our own country. It's too big.
No, 100% right. And when we kind of talk about Cuba, we always hear that name Meyer Lansky, but Trafficante had just as much interest there, maybe more, quite honestly.
I would say more.
Yeah, and his connections again go way back. Remember, if you go to Tampa today, it's just like Miami, very Cuban flavored, very Cuban cultured. That Spanish culture is huge there, and he's in a way, Santo Trafficante, kind of like the native son of Tampa. He is the head of Tampa, and it was almost a birthright to go to Cuba. That's where his family went. They were very invested there. I do want to talk a little bit about where he was in the national picture of the mafia, because in 1957, the world, and particularly this country, would get a glimpse of the mafia for the first time through the Appalachian meeting. Now, there'll be people that listen to this show that aren't aware of what the Appalachian meeting is. And it really is one of the most divisive, bad things that ever happened to the mafia, because at this point, the mafia is a shadowy criminal syndicate. Joe Valachi's not happened yet. The mafia is a very hidden society. And people in Iowa and Arkansas, they don't know what the mafia is. They may have heard about it through a film or something, but unless you live in New York, we don't really know what it is. And even there, you don't know what it is. But the mob has this meeting. Vito Genovese wants to make it known he's the guy now in the world of the mafia. So he assembles this huge meeting in this rural area of New York called Appalachian. And it was a home owned by a mobster, Joe Barbara, and hordes of mobsters around the country came. I'm talking about San Francisco family
Mm-hmm.
came, Denver, Tampa, New Orleans, the 5 families, Philadelphia, New Jersey, Chicago, Detroit, all these different places. They all descended on Appalachian. And think of it like The Godfather, right? You
Yep.
have this big wedding. You have all these big cars, and these state police in New York think something's up here.
Yeah.
Who are all these? Who are all these men in dark suits in these big Lincolns and Cadillacs coming into our little town? So
something's up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So they have this meeting, and through illegal, search and seizures. And look, the police after this would go on, they would say they had no legal basis to pull any of these people over or to even go into this meeting, but they did it, and they came up with a cachet of treasure. So they descend on the house. All these mobsters are running through creeks and the woods with their $1,000 shoes on. And one of the people there that day was Santo Trafficante. He was the representation from Tampa.
Mm-hmm.
And he was actually arrested. He was one of 60 people arrested that were at the mafia. Now, a couple got away. Carmine Galante, who was a Bonanno heavyweight, he actually ended up hiding in a closet in the home for 2 days until the police left, and then he left.
Oh, I didn't know that story. That's great.
Yeah. You have stories of, I think it was Nick Savella, Kansas City boss. He ended up getting away from the home, and the only reason he was arrested is because he and another mobster were outside of an elementary school, Appalachian Elementary. And these teachers looked at the window and they saw these shadowy individuals, and they said, well, who are those guys? And they called the police, and that's how they were unearthed. But this was a big problem for the mob because this was headline news everywhere. And remember, in those times, you got your newspaper or your radio, and that's what you heard. And all you'd hear is, shadowy conference busted. The mafia is in the forefront. So it kind of shows what Trafficante's level of prestige is. He's one of the main power points at this area. We have to remember he's still heavily involved in a drug trade. In fact, a 1962 report by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics listed him in the top 10 most influential drug dealers at the time in America. So a lot was going on. And, the Albert Anastasia stuff happens in New York. And interestingly enough, Chief, I don't know if you know this, at the time of the Anastasia hit, Santo Trafficante was in New York. I'm just going to throw that out there. I'm not saying anything.
He was staying at the same hotel where he got hit.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting. Just going to say that. Do I think
he does say that he was on a flight to Havana? I had checked out. I was gone.
Right.
Good story. Good cover.
Yeah. Now, as we know, in the early 60s, everything goes from being beautiful and sunny in Cuba, and everything was on top of the world for Trafficante people like Lansky. But then the night comes, Castro comes in, the regime comes in, and it goes from being a beautiful palace to, like I've said, a den of iniquity, where you have troops on the streets, the casinos are dead, they're basically demolished, and it is said that Trafficante got some of his money out of Cuba, but most of his monetary interests were gone. We know Lansky got destroyed.
Yeah. Do you wonder, because there are reports that Trafficante was playing both sides. Like he would give ammo, guns, sometimes Jeeps to Castro when he was still in the jungle. And he kind of liked the fact that he could play both sides. And he, so he's like, let's keep this place in turmoil. We'll keep Havana safe, but we'll keep like Fulgencio, Batista will need our help and we'll need the money. So he'll want to work with us even more. And then if Castro somehow wins, like we already have a relationship with him. And then Castro just wouldn't play ball once he won.
That's an interesting thought. I mean, I guess I'll say this. I have heard Trafficante would say at one point, in very little things that he would actually say. He was very quiet, never talked. He would say at one point he was held in what he would call a concentration camp for 2 weeks after the, grab of Havana and all these places by the Castro group. Now, again, do we actually believe that? We kind of liken it to like the Guatemala story by Carlos Marcello. It may have been a lot worse than he had let on than it was. That's an interesting thought. I've never actually heard about that. I would have to look deeper, but it is possible. I mean, these are mobsters in the end. But the big truth is the mafia got absolutely plundered in Cuba. And, as we talked about in the Roselli episode, not only was Roselli and other people involved with the CIA investigation and attempted assassination of Fidel Castro. Mayhew's involved. Trafficante's very involved with that as well, and he would actually admit that at one point in Senate testimony that he felt like Roselli, he was just helping the government, and that's what all these guys believed. And again, I look at it, and you mentioned it when you were on, is it was almost like the military, right? If your colonel says, "Hey, you need to go do this," you do it.
You just go do it.
Yeah. It was like in Armageddon, right? When that guy, it was the general or whatever, he's telling Billy Bob Thornton's character to the president says, blow this up. You listen to what I say, basically. It's almost like that. And it goes
a chain of command.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
There are theories and reports too that Trafficante would be like, oh yeah, like I'll I got people down there. I'll help you with that. We'll get Castro out. I want to get him out. And the CIA and Mayhew and these people would give him money and to perform it. And then he would just be like, I
can't do it.
Yeah. Well, or can't do it. Or just like, let's keep this. I'll be on the take with them forever. I'll figure it went bad. Like, let's try this. And he would just keep like little by little.
I got to tell you, that's pretty smart, quite honestly, because again, we talked about it. I think they tried 600 times to kill Castro.
I think it's 638 is the number.
Right. Yeah. So think about if you're Trafficante, you're getting 10K every time you don't do it. It's not possible to happen anyway. It's just like, it didn't happen this time. Maybe next time. Bring me more money.
I sniffed it out somehow.
Yeah. And we would find out that the government actually, according to them, they had no knowledge of this, and this was just rogue CIA people doing this, which is complete nonsense. The government wanted Castro dead, and they essentially tried it 630 plus times.
Yeah, I wonder if that was like a lesson from his father, being like, and he was with Antonori against Wall, but it was like, really, you just kind of let that play out and come out on top, but you kind of recede from that, maybe play both sides a little bit. And then that's something that's like a lesson that stuck with him, and he used it in different places, and maybe used it to bleed out the CIA, not bleed out the CIA, but just be on the take kind of forever and not have to worry about it.
One of the great things about being a high level mobster like he was, you have to be a master manipulator.
Yeah.
You have to use people. I always go back to a very interesting quote. There was a Genovese gangster, one of the biggest earners in mob history, Jimmy Napoli. A huge earner, made a ton of money. And Fred Trump in the 80s was very close to Jimmy Knapp, Donald's father. And he went to Donald, or Fred went to Jimmy and said, listen, my kid wants to get into Atlantic City, gambling. And Jimmy Knapp said, Fred, he'll never make it. He said, because guess what? You know who he has to deal with? Guys like me. He'll never make it. And this was before he even was in Atlantic City, before he built Trump Casino. And in the end, Jimmy Knapp was right. He didn't do well in the casino business. But that's the thing about mobsters. These academic types, they may have power, but you look at someone like Robert Kennedy or even Mayhew or any of these people, they were used by the mafia. They did what they had to do. And in the end, they were, collateral damage. The mob was always going to win generally in the end until we got to the RICO statute, and that made the mob lose. But as we know, in 1963, John Kennedy's killed. Now, we're not going to go into the assassination again. We've already done that. We've talked about this. A lot of this stuff melds together sometimes, but I just kind of want to talk about what I believe Mr. Trafficante's role is. You would, in a one-word answer, you believe that he was very involved, correct?
I think he was involved. There's that weird kind of connection between Trafficante, and then when he was in prison, like you talked about, he was in a concentration camp or whatever. He was snatched up. Like, they let him out to go to his daughter's wedding, but then he was supposedly on the line for a firing squad. But supposedly in that time, he met a guy named Lauren Hall, and Lauren Hall was the connection between Trafficante and Lee Harvey Oswald. And Oswald was connected to the CIA. And so he met this guy, Lauren Hall, in the Havana prison, and that was the initial connection. So there's something there where it's like, that's a loose end that feels like it's never tied up. And Lauren Hall, years later, gave a quote
Yes.
saying that there's only 2 people in the world alive that know what happened, and it's me and Santo Trafficante, and I'm not saying so I can stay alive.
Now it's funny. It's funny. I've heard people say that they discount that because Lauren Hall was supposedly drunk that night and giddy off of the fact that JFK was killed, which I don't believe. I believe he definitely knows, and he very much knew Jack Ruby as well, Lauren Hall. So we also have to remember the key person in this too. And to me, I think the actual mastermind of all of this, the little guy in New Orleans.
Marcelo.
Him and Trafficante were close. They knew each other very well. And what do we also know? There's another guy involved in this too.
Jimmy Hoffa?
Yeah. And he hated Kennedy. I mean, hated him.
Yeah.
Everybody knows that.
And they all have the same lawyer, that Frank Regano.
Frank Regano, right. And one of the things, and I know a lot of people that listen to the show, and even people that don't like The Irishman, they'll say, well, I hate The Irishman. The certain parts of The Irishman that I think are great is the JFK stuff. It was Pacino did very well in that acting role, because that whole scene where the flag's being lowered, he goes out and says, don't do that. Like there was talk that night, Jimmy Hoffa called Trafficante giddy. He was very happy. And
we got him.
Yeah. Exactly. Talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean that is the connection, and there's another one that I think it was Frank Regano was out that night with Trafficante, and the whole country's crying, mourning. This tragic thing that's caught on camera. It's on the news. Everybody's devastated, and those two are out toasting. And hey, they're in high spirits, and we're like, what the fuck is wrong with these people? And
I think Regano's wife talked about, she was I think she had mentioned at one point to his son Chris, who's done some things. She said she was blown away. She couldn't understand why they were so happy. And Regano actually, I think he did I think it was 1995. He did an interview where he kind of said to himself at that point, like, what am I doing? Like, who am I at this point? I'm actually celebrating.
Yeah. So he did give that comment. I think you're right. I think it was a 60 Minutes or something like that. And he was just like, yeah, like that was like a look in the mirror, kind of, get home and look in the mirror. Like I'm in too deep if I'm celebrating the death of the president. So and that goes back, like you talk about Marcelo, and it was really about, they felt kind of double crossed by the Kennedys. And Bobby, who was like, hey, like the original thought was, hey, well, let's just kill Bobby. Fuck, the attorney general is making our life hell. Let's just kill him. And they're like, cutting the tail off the snake doesn't do anything. You got to cut the head off. So then the target supposedly became JFK, and was all mutual interest and a lot of different people involved. It's one of those things. Like I will obsess about this until the day I die, I think, and they still won't release classified documents. So the whole thing.
Well, I think we all know why they won't do that. Listen, they're like I've said before, even when I put out the Rosselli episode, I got people hitting me up saying, oh, there's no way. I think if you don't believe the mob was involved, I think you are someone I could sell a beachfront property to in Kansas. I mean, there's just too much that how do all these people somehow know each other? You think that's by chance? There are 330 million people. And by that point in America, they're probably 250, 300.
Yeah.
You mean to tell me all these people, these Lauren Hall and Jack Ruby and Oswald and Marcello, and they all somehow knew each other. It's too perfect, right? And I also want to talk about in 1962, an individual from Cuba, Jose Alman, would tell the Washington Post about 15 years later that he would be offered multiple things from Santo Trafficante. And I want to read a direct quote. He claims that, according to Alman, he told Trafficante that JFK would be elected again. He was an FBI informant as well, this guy Alman. Trafficante would reply, quote, no, Jose, he is going to be hit. Now, Alman claimed to have reported Trafficante's comments to the FBI, who quote, dismissed the Kennedy warnings as gangland braggadocio. Now, he would also say, Alman, that he didn't believe that hit meant killed. He thought that meant like in the polls he would lose or something. Which it could just be him kind of trying to distance himself from
Yeah.
this. But we would hear a lot of these things. I know that there were certain guys that Carlos Marcello had a retreat outside of New Orleans, and they would go there and just bullshit about stuff, him and powerful people. And there was a guy similar to Alman. In fact, it may have been Alman as well, that claimed he heard Marcello mention this kind of stuff multiple times, that he won't, we're going to get him in Dallas and all this stuff. So there's too much perfection with all this, and it all melds together to believe that the mob wasn't directly involved in this. Now, for Trafficante, I just want to bring up Regano one more time, because his son, Chris, would back up the claim. In fact, when he was a kid, he remembers the day he heard Kennedy was killed. Frank Regano, he said, had his face was white for like hours. And he just didn't seem, Chris would say he just didn't seem correct. Now, we wouldn't hear much from Trafficante for a while. Throughout the 60s and 70s, he continued to make money. He continued to kind of mend himself from Cuba. In the early 80s, late 70s, and I don't know how much you know about this, but if you've seen Donnie Brasco, Santo Trafficante is portrayed in that film.
Yep.
Remember, Donnie's character takes them out on the boat, and Trafficante's involved. That actually happened in the 80s, late 70s, 80s. The Bonanno crime family and Lefty, Ruggiero, Sonny Black, they all went down to Florida to kind of grow their operation a little bit. They go to this area, Pasco County, and they open up this bottle club called King's Court, which we would find out about. That's all true. That all happened. And they needed Trafficante's approval to make that happen. Now, ultimately, Mr. Trafficante would be involved a little bit once all this stuff goes down with Donnie and everything. And he never actually gets jammed up in anything, but it is an interesting connection to the Bonanno crime family. You needed Trafficante's blessing if you wanted to do anything.
He was the king.
Yes, he absolutely was. In 1978, Mr. Trafficante would be called to testify in front of the House Select Committee investigating assassinations. Around that time, we would find the Warren Commission did their reports, and they would venture to say that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. He happened to kill a sitting president by himself with no help. He was just a lunatic gunman that had an issue with Kennedy and killed him that day in Dallas.
And the greatest sniper who ever lived, apparently.
Right. Now, this committee not only looked into the assassination of John Kennedy, it also looked into the death of Dr. Martin Luther King, who I will say, until I don't do this anymore, and even after that, the mob directly was involved with that as well.
So I don't know as much about that one. So you think they were directly involved?
Yeah. And in fact, I mean, and this is something that I unearthed in the Marcello episode. Marcello was a fervent racist.
Yeah.
Fervent. I mean, he hated blacks, hated Jews. He donated to the Ku Klux Klan. If you're looking at James Earl Ray, he was very connected with multiple members of the New Orleans crime family, Sam Saya, different people. And he spent a lot of time in New Orleans. I'll have to send you some of the stuff I have on that. I think it's very likely that Mr. King was killed by the mob, or again, I think James Earl Ray did it, but I think he was sent by the mafia, and he received certain payments from certain people around that time. So I think it definitely makes sense. Now, during this committee, Trafficante, this 78, he's pretty old. He's born in 1914. So he's pretty old. He's got medical problems. He would take the fifth reluctantly 15 times. He would be asked about multiple things, including his connection to Jack Ruby. He was threatened with contempt of court if he didn't speak. And look, if you look at any mobster back then, I urge you sometime, Tony Accardo had to go in front of these committees when he was old. And he had some really funny involvements in some of those Senate committees. These guys don't talk. You might say to them, "Hey, you were spotted last week with so-and-so. What does that person do for a living?" "I don't know that person." "Well, you were with him. What do you mean you don't know what he does for a living? You don't read?" He goes, No, I just read the paper, whatever it says in the paper. That's what I believe. They're shrewd, these guys, very shrewd. So he didn't say much, but we would find out that he did have some sort of involvement with this alleged conspiracy to kill Fidel Castro. And he really just chalked it up to, he didn't do anything wrong. He was following rules.
Following orders.
Now, I went ahead Chief, and I did do one piece of something I wanted to do in this whole JFK thing. I went to Scott Deitch, and I regard Scott Deitch as the king of Tampa mob stuff. He has written so many books about this, and I asked him straight up. I said, what do you think? What do you end up believing with JFK and Trafficante?" And he said something pretty, I think, rudimentary, but I think it makes total sense. He basically said he was visited by Jack Ruby in Cuban prison back in 1959 when Castro jailed Santo for the time following the revolution. Trafficante was also hired by the CIA, as we know, to kill Castro as part of the anti-Castro operations. He also confessed to his attorney, Frank Regano, that he and Carlos Marcello ordered the hit on JFK to get his brother Bobby off their backs. Santo's confession was called into question by some people, but to him, he truly believes and convinced that it was all true. So again, very rudimentary and basically backs up everything we just said here. So these are multiple people. These are high-level authors. These are the sons of people like, Frank Regano. These are very high-up people. I mean, we've seen Robert Blakely, the creator of the RICO Act. We've seen Lamar Waldron, who's written 5 or 6 books about this. Everyone has the same agreement with us.
Yeah, I know. And it's one of those things too, where it's like they weren't necessarily leaving anything to chance. People should look into, there was going to be, the hit was originally going to be in Chicago at Air Force and Army, or Air Force, I think it was Air Force and Army. We were playing a football game at Soldier Field, and JFK was going to go and do like the coin toss. And they had a parade route, the same thing. They had the same sort of guy, like the same loner guy, kind of picked out, former military guy. I believe he was at the same base in Japan as Oswald was. And then like there was too much chatter about it. So JFK canceled the trip. And then it was like all the same like planning framework where it was going to be in Chicago. It was like November 3rd. And then 3 weeks later, they got him November 22nd. So this was going to happen. And the powerful people that we've talked about this entire episode and the last episode as well, they were going to make it happen one way or another.
One thing I've always found fascinating about the government of this country is they have pulled the wool over the people's eyes in this country for so long. I'm blown away. They actually think people buy into this nonsense. Like, our investigation concluded that one person did all this. Like, it's amazing that, and it's almost like, in the end, like if someone constantly lies to you, you start to realize, well, maybe I'm just not going to believe anything they say. And through years of deterioration with the government telling people one thing and then doing another, it's just amazing that there are actually people out there that still believe this nonsense, that this was one person that did this. You need people like this to help you. It's that simple.
Yeah.
Powerful people get you places. And that's any walk of life. You are connected. It doesn't matter if you have talent or not. There are people that will help you get there if you know them.
You ever seen the movie with DiCaprio called The Gangs in New York?
Yeah.
Okay. There's a line in that movie where it's like, the law has to appear to be being upheld, especially when it's being broken. Right. So that's why you work with the mafia, is to have them get their hands dirty and they do all this shit. And then you just point at them like, well, they're criminals. Okay. It wasn't us, but you're paying them. So they're
plausible deniability. Yeah,
exactly. And it's like, but the law is the law. And if we wanted to get really philosophical about it, we started this episode talking about religion. Now, like, religion's not a thing. So the government's just the highest power. And I think people just believe whatever is said because that's the highest power that people recognize.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the 80s come. Obviously, he deals Trafficante with, he's still making money, but things are, as we know, changing. The lottery is now a thing. So Belita maybe isn't as potent, right? Selling drugs is a lot harder. There's a lot, more serious laws with that. So, I think, and plus he's getting older. He's developing medical problems. He's got kidney issues. He's got all sorts of problems. One thing I did not talk about, and something that is not involved in this episode at all, is going to prison for Trafficante Sr. or Jr. in this country. Mm-hmm. It must be said that even in the 80s, the government would try to bust Mr. Trafficante on multiple cases, including that Donnie Brasco case where they believe they had him on something there. Nothing ever came with that. They also tried to bust him on a RICO insurance fraud case. Nothing ever happened there. And ultimately, his medical issues got him out of it. By this point, Trafficante is in his 70s. And in March of 1987, he would actually be scheduled to fly to Houston for a heart bypass. Now, interestingly enough, the bypass surgery was actually done and successful. Mr. Trafficante didn't wake up, though, from anesthesia and would die 2 days later on March 17, 1987, at 72 years old. He would have a wife and 2 daughters. No, he wouldn't have a son, interestingly enough. He wouldn't be able to kind of take that mantle and pass it on. One thing I will
drop
say,
out of school early enough.
Good point.
Yeah.
Good point. Yeah. One thing, as I said, that is notable about him and certain other folks in this country, him and his father never spent one day in a prison cell, not one.
It's wild. That you got to be very shrewd, because if they had their hands in every single bit of prostitution, every single piece of illicit activity you could think of, they were touching it. Yeah. To never get fingered on any of it is crazy.
Now remember as well, as you just eloquently talked about, these are guys that are the biggest criminals in this country. They are involved in every criminal subset we have from a charge standpoint. They also were involved directly in attempting 600 plus times to kill the leader of another country.
Yeah.
They were likely involved with killing a sitting president. And in all of that, never spent one day in prison. It's really fascinating. It's crazy to think about in a way. You're probably wondering what would happen to the Tampa Bay Mafia upon the death of Mr. Trafficante. It would actually continue. The son of Angelo Lascalzo, Vincent Lascalzo, would take over in the 80s, and he would actually do some decent things. He actually would expand the operation a little bit. He had an individual working for him called Steve Raffa, who would actually take a lot of the Tampa Bay Mafia and take it down to Miami. They would expand a little bit. All these guys were legit businessmen. The problem was Lascalzo was constantly under indictment. As I said, the RICO Act not only hurt the Tampa Bay Mafia, but it hurt pretty much every family by the 80s and 90s. And the mob went from being this huge power in the 50s and 60s to a relative, very powerful organization. But by the late 80s was a fractured group. The RICO Act really hurt the Mafia. Now, I do want to make one point. The guy Steve Raffa, who was in Miami, he would actually commit suicide in 2000, which he was facing indictment. There were a lot of things, and the mobsters just weren't built the same way maybe as the ones previous. Today, the Tampa Bay Mafia is completely defunct. There is no known Tampa Bay Mafia left. Now, I will say, one of the interesting things about Tampa, it is a very fertile ground to this day for the New York Five families. There are many families represented down there. And interestingly enough, in 2008, the final racketeering case against John Gotti Jr. John Gotti Jr. faced the federal government 5 times. His final case was based out of Tampa. Now, the feds would allege that he sent people down there, including a guy, John A. Light, Ronnie Trucchio, certain guys like that. He sent them down there. They were dealing drugs. They were involved in strip clubs. And the final case he had involved things in Tampa. Now, John Gotti Jr. would actually beat the rap in that case and is a free man out of the Mafia, according to him.
Yep.
But there are a lot of other connections to Tampa. I know most families, particularly the Gambinas, have always had people down there. We think of it like open territory. I know there's people down in Miami. Genoveses have sent people down there. So nowadays it's open territory, and the name Trafficante is really just a distant memory. But when we look back on Santo Trafficante, we put him really at the high echelon of
he's
Mafia.
At the apex. I mean, he was a bad boy. He's a bad boy and a guy who, I don't know, there's something so appealing about him because he did seem so smart and he was polished. Like you talk about, I'm blanking on the guy's name though, the guy that he supposedly hit in the barbershop. Okay. Or even true. Or the guy Lascalzo, like they're just a little bit rough around the edges. It felt like Trafficante could rub elbows with anybody and swim in any circle, and it makes him, like, to me, like a fascinating figure where it's just like he was the best at whatever. Like certain guys could only be successful in the Mafia. I feel like he's a guy who could have done anything. He could have been the president. Like, he was
Well,
that smart.
I think there's two types of mobsters, and I talk about generally on this show. We talk about the type that is truly a transcendent person, whether it's like Frank Costello or Meyer Lansky or Trafficante or Marcello. And while all of them make a ton of money, they still are shrewd enough to get things done without getting their hands dirty, right? So like they may not look like gangsters, but they have the ability to get rid of you at any second, like a Charlie Wall, where no one's ever going to implicate you in that because you have other people doing it. And those people are able to crack heads, and they're still able to make tons of money. They have political power. They have connections. They move, and they can hang out with a street corner thug, and they can hang out with the diplomat in a swanky hotel.
They're persuasive,
yes.
and they have to be able to connect with anybody and be persuasive to anybody in any circle. And and I don't mean that like persuasive with, the point of a gun. I just mean like with their tongue, like they're sharp tongues, and they can, almost like a chameleon, just be like, well, I'm in this circle today. I'm in the talking to senators tomorrow and the CIA the next day and street thugs the day after that. And they can play in any park.
Very shrewd. And listen, I mean, in the career of Santo Trafficante, right? You look at the American dream, we call it, right? His father comes over at the turn of the century, 1901. Okay. He doesn't know the language, gets involved with the underworld, has a son. He becomes the boss of an entire city in the South, makes his way into Cuba, sets his son up to be the next heir apparent. They then become very close with the mafia in New York. They have a connection for life. They then ascend and take themselves into a fertile ground where they make hundreds of millions of dollars just through one country, not into the fact that they've made hundreds of millions of dollars through legal lotteries, gambling, prostitution, the drug trade, everything and anything, bookmaking, extortion, everything. He then dies. The son takes over, is involved with some of the highest profile people in this country as far as getting rid of them. Okay. Yep. President, foreign leaders. And through all that, never does a day in jail, is a rector in a way of this country. Okay. Yeah. In the criminal world, I don't know. And that's why these people have to be talked about. They're that interesting because they truly were the upper echelon of criminal in this country. I don't know if I can think of anybody bigger than that. Right. And people like Santo Trafficante are at the top of the heap when it comes to the transformative people. So yep. I feel like in the last couple of weeks, we have definitely made it a point to make it known to every single person that listens to this show and to the people that maybe just listen to it. The mob was involved in Kennedy. I feel like we've talked about it. We've conquered it. But maybe we'll do that investigative report down the road, maybe a 10-part series.
I like that idea. I like that. I think that's a very good idea.
Maybe we can foray that. I have always had an idea for Barstool Sports. You want to hear it?
Yeah.
Barstool Sports needs to get into the, not the documentary world, but the investigative world, okay, where maybe it's a subset of the Sitdown, where we put on these, we get resources from the company, and we put on these very well done documentaries. I mean, how many people that are our age or younger don't know about this stuff? We talked about it. Now, we can make it fun and interesting, but these investigative looks into things need to happen, and who better to do it than us?
I would agree. I feel like there's been one real documentary aside from the documentary about Barstool itself. My guy Eddie did it.
Yeah,
he did it on Travis the Chimp. I don't know if you've ever heard that story, but it's a wild fucking story. But it was a great, like, he did a documentary. He traveled to Missouri, he traveled to Connecticut, East Coast, whatever. It came out spectacular. So there is a model to do it in this company. Maybe we should just do that.
And remember, we know about the Kennedy. There's so many things because, like we said before, they are the real scumbag family of the history of our country. And you have Marilyn Monroe, and you have all these Joe DiMaggio and Frank Sinatra and all these very powerful people. So
I mean, they're a mob family too, who just went the other way. Like, you talk about the academics, but it's almost like like Joe Kennedy was a bootlegger, but he was just, but he had a Harvard degree. So it's a little bit different.
It's almost like what we talked about at the beginning. Just because you're a priest does not mean you can't be a mob associate, right? Just because you're a Harvard graduate does not mean you can't be a mob associate.
Right. And like that scene in The Godfather where he's talking about, I wanted you to be Senator Corleone. I wanted you to be, this Corleone. Like, and I do feel like Joe Kennedy was like, hey, like, I'm an Irish guy. I am sneaky from the streets because he grew up kind of poor until he made it. And he was like, I'm going to make sure my sons are in power. I feel like Trafficante Sr. could have done the same thing. He could have easily been like, hey, you're not going to, you stay in school and go to Tulane and maybe you're the president. Or he's like, actually, you drop out of school, you're going to inherit the empire. And it could have gone like either way. And his son seemingly was smart enough to do either path.
His, as I've said before, his lineage was created for him when he was born.
Yeah.
He had no other, and that's most of these people. That's what their lives are dictated when they're born. This is what you're going to be, and that's that. So, always good to have you, Chief. Always a great conversation. Yeah, I like having you, man. It's always good conversation. I know that you guys do the dog walk. I was actually on the dog a couple weeks ago.
Saw that, yeah.
We did John Gotti. It was pretty fun. Tell the people I think really like you. I think they like your content. What do you got coming up? Anything special?
Yeah, we got a pretty good routine. So we're doing Chicago sports. Bears beat the Patriots last night, so that was pretty good. So we talked about that this week a little bit, and then we got the dog walk, which we don't know how to market it because it's some days it's just bullshit and drafts. Other days it's we'll get into some heavier stuff, and then we'll interview a mailman. Like we're kind of all over the place, but it's my favorite product that we put out. And I think if you like this kind of format that we're doing, like Eddie and I do some of that, but just, if we were smarter, we probably would have focused on one category like you did and own it. But it's like whatever interests us that day.
But see, I kind of look at what you guys do, and like I think one thing about the sit down that I've tried to change a little bit recently is like on YouTube, I'm in kind of a tough spot because the audience only wants mafia content now.
Yeah.
Where like I kind of want to occasionally go off into talking about like Victor Boot or a serial killer or a drug cartel boss. I think sometimes I almost look at you and kind of say, wow, it's cool. You can just kind of talk about whatever. But
Jeff, move to Chicago. Be a part of the migration. Come out here to Chicago next year, and we'll figure something out.
Well, that being said, it's funny you say that because that is something that a lot of people are thinking about, I think, at the company. So maybe, you never know. I don't know if I'd fit in out there, but I will say Philadelphia and Chicago seem similar in a way. If I went to Chicago, I have all sorts of ideas to do for content there with some of the shit that goes on. But Chief, we can follow Barstool Chief on Twitter at Barstool Chief. And I'm sure we'll have you on again. We got to do some Chicago people maybe at some point.
Yep.
Chief, good to hear from you. Good to see you. Thanks for coming on, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me anytime. I love doing the show.
Yeah, good seeing you. As always, guys, I thank you for listening. I appreciate Chief being here. It's always good to get him on. Him and I have such a good chemistry, I feel like. We have a great conversation. We tell a story about somebody from history, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope we did Santo Trafficante Jr. some justice. As always, if you enjoy the show and you're listening to us right now on iTunes or Spotify or Google Pods, if you're new, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Make sure you become members of the feed. Leave us a review. Rate us a little bit. If you're watching us on YouTube after the fact, what up, everybody on YouTube? Do me a favor, if you're new around here, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you never miss a sit-down video. Yeah, vice versa. Look at the content on YouTube if you're on iTunes. If you're on iTunes, look at the stuff on YouTube. It's all one. It's all one sit-down show, and I do it for you, the listener. As always, we're presented by Barstool Sports. I will see you again next week. And I want to tell you guys next week, we have a really cool episode. I'm going to have an individual on that for 20 plus years worked in the DEA. He was one of the leading agents in the fight against the Mexican drug cartels. He's very interesting, and we're going to speak to him next week. We also have some cool episodes coming up about some other mob stuff and some cool interviews as well. So make sure you continue to listen. We'll see you next week here on the Sit Down.